highlighted that. Allow me to reiterate RCMRD's commitment in supporting the operations of the AfriGEO Secretariat. We are committed to providing the resources required to make this undertaking successful, provide office space and all personnel required to foresee this. I wish to note that the operations of RCMRD as an institution are very much aligned to AfriGEO priorities to a great extent. And that makes it easy for us to create logistical and operational synergy in some of the activities we undertake together. Briefly, I wish to articulate some of the key achievements of the AfriGEO Secretariat in the last 3 years. We have actively supported as the liaison and coordination arm of AfriGEO with the Geo Secretariat, worked very closely with other regional geos, AmeriGEO, EuroGEO, AOGEO. We have also supported the geo-affiliated initiatives, community activities and flagship programs such as GeoGLAM for food security, GeoLDN for land degradation, GeoHuman Planet for mapping missing planets, GeoBlue Planet to host site events, and through our engagement with the capacity building working group. We supported a surveillance activity on tracking illegal vessels in the West African region. We have also been supporting the Digital Earth Africa program, DEA, which, as you know, is now a GEO initiative. We have worked with DEA's implementing partners through RCMRD to ensure that their strategic goals for the regions are achieved, and also to ensure that the prioritization of the applications, data, and tools developed through the DEA are aligned to user needs. We hope that in the coming phase, we shall be able to downscale more activities that support a solutions-based framework of development in our regions. I am happy to know that RCMRD, as the AfriGEO Secretariat, has enjoyed profound support from other institutions and programs from within and outside the region. I wish to acknowledge the immense support and logistical inputs from institutions and partners such as the Severe Eastern and Southern Africa program, the Severe West Africa programs. Severe is a partnership with USAID and NASA, SANSA, CSIR, the GMES and Africa project, the EO Research and Development Facility, Soils for Africa project, just to mention but a few. The Secretariat is also thankful to all governments on the African continent who have facilitated its affairs in one way or another. In this connection, I also wish to acknowledge the focused and firm leadership and strategic direction provided by the AfriGEO Steering Committee members, represented by South Africa, Seychelles, Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, Mauritius, Egypt, Gabon, Uganda, Nigeria, and Morocco, and other participating organizations like RCMRD, UNECA, AgriMet, and the OSS. Therefore, I am delighted to note that the preparations and implementation of this 5th AfriGEO Symposium has full endorsement of the AfriGEO Steering Committee, from its theme to the focus areas and the design of sessions. The benefits of this clear leadership are thus clear. For instance, in the last 3 years, we have also seen more engagements taking place with policymakers and more countries joining the GEO family. Once again, I congratulate and welcome Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Namibia for making this move. For the near future, it is my hope that the AfriGEO fraternity in the next 3 years will focus on growing African industries in Earth observation and expand the spin-off benefits of this growth to value-added services that solve societal challenges. The advancement of technology and the increasing opportunities for GIS and Earth observation to solve societal challenges in the agriculture, water, land use, and climate-related disaster sectors places African scientists and decision makers at a privileged position to fast-track service delivery through EOUs. This also places the small, medium, and micro enterprises at strategic positions to grow their businesses, increase their service base, and look up to green opportunities for public-private partnerships. We just had the COP the other day, and I think the green opportunities could not be better emphasized. Indeed, in Africa, we have seen the commitments by governments in the last 10 years to develop their national space agencies to better coordinate Earth observation within their countries. We've also seen the programs being very, very deliberate in including private sector engagement as part of their implementation strategies. In line with these developments, I believe the AfriGEO is making strides in enhancing support for embracing inclusive growth as espoused by GEO's equality, diversity, and inclusion statement. I therefore believe that the AfriGEO's efforts to adopt and implement the EDI actions at a regional level will bear fruit, particularly when aligned with other continuing plans, such as the Africa Space Strategy and Policy and the Africa Agenda 2063. In doing so, our plans and activities should also not lose sight of nurturing the youth into the EO and space sector, who constitute the largest percentage of our African population. I commend efforts by our partners such as SAVIR and SANSA, who have the South African Space Agency, who have designed innovative activities to involve the youth, dubbed the Space Challenge and the EO Africa Challenge, respectively. It is my belief that this is a critical component of our capacity building efforts that enhances sustainability in this sector. In closing, once again, I wish to reiterate the RCMRD's unwavering support for the AfriGEO Secretariat, and do wish you fruitful discussions at the 5th AfriGEO Symposium. Thank you, and thank you to the Secretariat colleagues who are here, Phoebe, Anastasia, and others for organizing this. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, Mr.
Abubakar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the work done by LCMD hosting the Secretariat of AfriGEO. All our thank you to the CEO of the SRMD, and thank you again for the technical work you do and your commitment to international projects. SRMD has put the use of spatial data at the heart of the decision, and this is a great achievement. Thank you. Before closing this opening session, we have the keynote, which will be delivered by Professor Francois Angel Brech. Professor Francois, you have the floor to deliver your speech. Thank you. Professor Francois is online.
Indeed, okay. I am. Thank you very much, Abubakar. And many thanks to Imran Saluji for the invitation. He's from Sanza in South Africa, as many of you will know. And many thanks for this great privilege to present for the very first time at the AfriGEO Symposium. And also many thanks to Phoebe and Stella for all the arrangements towards getting me involved and onto the program and so forth. So I am just going to share my screen and then I'll jump into this talk. So I trust we are in business and that someone will stop me if my screen is not being shared. Good day to everybody from all over the continent and I guess also around the world. I've been asked to provide a brief overview of the IPCC Assessment Report 6. And I also added to that request some thoughts on the outcomes of COP26. All, of course, within the context of future climate change impacts in Africa. I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who had a great privilege of being very, very closely involved in helping to compose the Assessment Report 6, specifically the Working Group 1 report, an endeavor of the last 3 years working with about almost 300 scientists climate scientists from across the world. So let me briefly take you through these findings. And as I do so, I'm sure you will all see the very obvious importance of Earth observations for climate change assessments and monitoring climate change impacts and so forth. So first of all, let me start at the beginning. I think we have all seen, of course, since the report was released back in August this year, the immense impact it has had, starting in the media. Of course, shortly after the release of the report, the United Nations Secretary General referred to the report as a code red for humanity. And that is really how the report became known. That was such an accurate description, I think. And it's all because of the fact that the report goes to great lengths to list the most recent evidence we have about climate change that is already occurring across the globe. But then also the report provides some evidence that aspects of climate change, including global warming, is in fact happening even faster than the estimations were, say, a decade ago. And the hard reality is that the window that we have left open to avoid these most catastrophic impacts of climate change across the world, but also in Africa, as Jana pointed out this morning, that window is closing. Let me show you some of the details. So this is, of course, the very basic, the very starting point of an IPCC assessment. It shows on the x-axis time and on the y-axis the level of global warming. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the future level of global warming is really still, as we are meeting here for the symposium this week, in the hands of humans. The worst case scenario is depicted by that dark red line. And it shows us that if we do not mitigate climate change, global warming can reach a staggering level of close to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The report then also, of course, assesses that the current level of global warming is about 1.1 degrees Celsius. Now, that means that we are very, very close towards exceeding the so-called dangerous thresholds of global warming, namely 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And that light blue line there at the bottom of this graph, that is really what COP26 was all about. It's about mitigating climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions rapidly, so that we still stand a chance to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, another reason why the United Nations Secretary General, I think, why he referred to the report as a code red for humanity is because of another important finding of the report, a startling finding as well. Namely that even if we do everything right now, even if COP26 delivered to the biggest expectations that existed around it before the event, in the presence of best effort mitigation, it is still more likely than not that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. So effectively, we have left this process too late. On the other hand, a very positive finding from the report is that if we do pursue as humans a best effort mitigation, the chance is excellent that we can restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. What do I mean when I speak about best effort climate change mitigation? Well, I'm speaking about this type of scenario into the future, where carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere that you can see here on the y-axis start to decline immediately. So that's a massive decline in emissions in the 2020s, achieving what was so much discussed around COP26, halving the emissions by about 2030, and then reaching so-called net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by about the middle of the century. So as we all know, of course, an immense challenge. I will reflect soon about the successes and failures of COP26 in terms of getting the world onto this path towards halving emissions by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Just first, some other interesting aspect of this type of scenario. This light blue pathway into the future is really what we need if we want to stand a chance of avoiding these most dangerous impacts of future climate change. I think what too few people realize is that we also need so-called negative emissions in the second half of the century. That means humans need to invent technologies that currently don't exist, namely technologies that can be applied at scale to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we also need some negative emissions to stand a realistic chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius during this century. So immense challenges ahead of humans, our species, in terms of climate change mitigation over the next several decades. So what about COP26? Let me just do a very brief overview. I mean, there are so many opinions now about whether the conference was a success or a failure. I think the reality is that it has achieved something in between. So I'll just measure some of the outcomes of COP26 briefly in terms of what the International Energy Agency recommended a few months ago in terms of what the outcome should be. So firstly, if we do want to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's very clear there really should be no further fossil fuel projects being pursued across the world. For example, no new coal-fired power plants should be approved. And there are important findings and successes from COP26 in this regard. For example, a number of countries have agreed to no longer fund any overseas coal projects from 2023 onwards. If you can look at that inset at the left-hand side, already well ahead of the conference, China, for example, announced that China will no longer fund overseas coal-fired power plants. That's a very, very important decision made by China already ahead of the meeting and supported by many other important countries in terms of their economic strength at COP26. It means, for example, that a country such as my own, South Africa, will certainly never get funding again to build another big coal power plant, such as our Medupi and Kasili power plants, for example. Then, what about achieving net zero emissions by 2050 by that light blue line in order to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, the analysis has been done and it's still being refined, but I think if we carefully look at concrete commitments made by countries at COP26, we are not there at all. The estimations are rather, if you look at them objectively, committing us to about 2.4 degrees Celsius of global warming during the course of this century. So right now, we have to be realistic. We are committed to further warming. And you have to be a very, very big optimist to think that we are not going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius substantially, still in the first half of this century, unfortunately. And then finally, very interestingly, the International Energy Agency earlier this year and the IPCC in its special report back in 2018 has come up with really consistent estimates of what the mitigation process will cost us. So if we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, it will cost the world about 150 trillion US dollars. But the International Energy Agency also estimates that that investment and that big revolution towards renewable energy on the planet will result in a growth in the global GDP of about 0.4% per year. So this is so important for Africa. There are really immense opportunities for economic growth if these investments can happen from the developed world into developing economies to help those economies with the transition towards renewable energy. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2050, about 70% of the world's electricity generation needs to be from renewable sources. They think the growth in renewable sources will not be sufficient to supply all the energy. They think, and the other 30% will be largely nuclear power. That is now in a world that really wants to achieve carbon neutrality. Now, also in terms of that estimate of the International Energy Agency, I don't think COP26 has delivered. For example, two major economies, China and India, currently responsible for about 57% of the world's emissions, are not making that commitment of carbon neutrality by 2050, only later on in the second half of the 21st century. So a last thought on these negotiations. I think everybody in the world has a role to play. We find about 30% of the world's emissions today originating from China. If you look at all the countries that are submitting, that are emitting 1.5% or less of the world's emissions, it's a startling fact that another 30% of the world's emissions are coming from these smaller emitting countries, smaller emitters. So everybody needs to contribute to the mitigation process. And another very positive aspect I'd like to point out from COP26 is the fact that China and the USA, with the USA responsible for about 15% of the emissions today, have agreed to collaborate on climate change mitigation. The details of the collaboration, I guess, will still have to be determined, but it's positive that the two superpowers have agreed to collaborate despite all the other differences they have at the moment. So now a bit about climate change impacts across the world and then focusing on Africa. The top left graph is what I've shown already, projected global warming levels as a function of the mitigation decisions we will be making over the next decade or so. Top right-hand side, surprisingly, to some extent, I guess for people that live in my part of the world, subtropical Southern Africa, precipitation is increasing already across the world's land masses on the average and will continue to increase for as long as global warming continues. It's actually quite simple to understand that a warmer atmosphere can, in general, hold more moisture than a cooler atmosphere, and there's more water vapor available to build storm systems and eventually produce precipitation. But that's not true for all parts of Africa, as I will soon show. Bottom left graph, another clear fingerprint of climate change, directly informed by remote sensing technologies. Well-known fact, of course, that Arctic sea ice is in decline. During the last decade, we've seen the lowest levels of Arctic sea ice in recorded history. And a shocking finding from the report is that under these low mitigation futures, we will completely lose Arctic sea ice and one of the world's most precious and unique ecosystems by the middle of the century. That's now in late summer, that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free. Sea level rise on the right-hand side, critically important for all of us living in the low-lying parts of the world. On the low mitigation future, sea level rise may well range between 1 and 1.9 meters by 2150. Now, a sea level rise of a meter is, of course, sufficient to displace hundreds of millions of people from the world's low-lying coastal areas. With strong mitigation, on the other hand, we can still restrict sea level rise to below half a meter towards the end of the century. So that brings us to the important topic of global tipping points. Unfortunately, if we will reach levels of global warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, the report has found that it's possible that the irreversible collapse of the Greenland ice sheet and possibly also the West Antarctic ice sheet will be triggered. Now that's 12 meters of sea level rise. Of course, it will take millennia for the ice sheets to melt away completely, but it means that our generation will commit future generations to literally less living space, a smaller planet, one can put it like that. So sustained global warming of 2 degrees Celsius is estimated to be that it will cause sea level rise in the order of 6 meters over the next 2,000 years. But just remember that sea level rise is, of course, something happening already, as many of you will know from your own work, and that it may well displace hundreds of millions of people over the next several decades, if we will be heading towards that 1 meter of sea level rise. Now, bringing the message home to Africa in the last part of my presentation today. These maps that you'll find in the IPCC Working Group 1 report show patterns of temperature change across the world as a function of the level of global warming. So at the top left graphic, you can see a world that has warmed by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what you can see is that certain parts of Africa will warm by considerably higher amounts. In the southern hemisphere, we find, in fact, the highest rate of warming detected thus far, nowhere else but in Botswana. And that is a function of the regional climate system of Southern Africa, that it relates to these big subtropical high pressures that form in this part of the world. But you can see Southern Africa and also subtropical North Africa, these parts of Africa are warming the fastest. And should the world warm by 3 or 4 degrees Celsius globally on the average, then the temperature increases in the subtropical parts of Africa, south and north, can only be described as devastating. We are then talking about regional temperature increases that approach 6 degrees Celsius or even more towards the end of the century. And back in 2018, the IPCC found in its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that means the end of the maize crop in Southern Africa and in East Africa, a staggering realization. It also will mean the end of cattle in the subtropical parts of Africa. No cattle industry can survive that type of temperature increase, purely because of the impact of the heat stress and the heat waves on cattle, and in fact on large mammals in general. What about rainfall changes in Africa? So remotely sensed precipitation data sets are nowadays so important, of course, to monitor these changes and to verify the climate models that we use to project these changes into the future. But you can see that the rainfall futures of Africa the rainfall features of Africa differ considerably depending on which part of the continent we're looking at. Here where I live in Southern Africa, you can see that the general expectation is that the region will become drier as global warming continues. And it is a trend that the IPCC reports as assessed can already be detected. On the other hand, very large parts of tropical Africa, including East Africa and the Sahel, are projected to become generally wetter. So fascinating, the different challenges that will be experienced in different parts of Africa as a function of the level of global warming. Mediterranean North Africa, of course, it's very similar in climate than the southern tip of Southern Africa and that part of the world. And the Mediterranean stretching into Europe, of course, is projected to also become generally drier, not wetter. So the changes behind these projected future patterns of rainfall and temperature are well understood, that the underlying physical mechanisms, for example, in the southern hemisphere, the so-called westerly winds are projected to shift towards the pole in a warmer world. That means fewer cold fronts reaching the southern parts of Southern Africa, and that means less winter rain. So towards concluding, the main other aspect I'd like to point out to the audience today is that we may be facing so-called tipping points in Africa in the next few decades as a consequence of continued climate change. I'll go through these really very briefly, basically 30 seconds per tipping point, and then I'll conclude. Firstly, let us now take note of the fact that this transition towards renewable energy brings substantial opportunities for Africa in terms of economic investment in a growing renewable sector. But should African countries choose not to pursue this transition, I think the risks are becoming clearer and clearer, and it's very, very clear after COP26 that fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel assets will very, very quickly become stranded assets over the next several decades. Then I just want to talk briefly about 4 climate-related risks. I'll just spend 30 seconds on each. The first is day zero droughts. Cape Town in South Africa had a big scare, as some of you will know. 2015 to 17, there was a big drought and Cape Town almost ran out of water. But in a world that becomes generally drier and warmer, like in subtropical Southern Africa and Mediterranean North Africa, the risk of these day zero type droughts in many of the African cities will become bigger. So that is a critical risk in terms of economic impacts. Secondly, heat waves. Heat waves impact on agriculture. And as I've already mentioned, should we reach 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, the science tells us it will be the end of the maize crop and the cattle industry across Africa. But I personally think that if we not only look at biophysical impacts, but also at the socioeconomics of farming, including subsistence farming, that tipping point will occur earlier, not at 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, but maybe somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. Thirdly, heat waves. Everywhere in Africa where people live in informal settlements, where you don't have air conditioning and where you don't have easy access to cool water, especially if you're an elderly person, heat waves are literally life-threatening. I think the risk of unprecedented heat waves in terms of magnitude occurring already in the next 10 years across the African continent, that risk is completely underestimated, and I'm deeply concerned about this risk in the near future. Finally, we saw, unfortunately, the devastation that a Category 3 hurricane can bring to Africa. This is a satellite picture of tropical cyclone Idai making landfall at Beira on the 14th of March 2019. More than 1,300 people died. The biggest flood disaster ever recorded in Africa south of the equator. The report is clear. In a warmer world, Category 4 and 5 hurricanes will occur more frequently across the world, also in Southern Africa. And they can reach locations where such intense hurricanes have never made landfall over Africa before, not in recorded history at least. For example, as far south as Maputo in southern Mozambique, or even at Richardsbay in South Africa. This is the last slide. Often when I give these climate change overviews, I find that there's a feeling of despair in the audience afterwards, which of course is, I guess, not unexpected. We are facing immense challenges, colleagues. We are all scientists, so we can look these challenges in the eye. I just want to mention two positive aspects, and that will be the end of my talk. Firstly, we are the scientists, and science gives us an idea of what the risks are. So we shouldn't be caught by surprise by these increasing climate change impacts across Africa. Science gives us a chance to prepare. Earth observation is important in terms of climate model verification and to monitor the changes that have already occurred. So this community I have the privilege to speak to today, of course, your role is a critical one moving forward in helping Africa to monitor what's happening and to help to prepare for what's coming. And then secondly, of course, global warming, the level of global warming is still in our hands. So if the world makes the right decisions and if Africa contributes its fair share to mitigation, whilst on the other hand, receiving fair financial support from the global north in terms of making this transition, we can still prevent at least 2 degrees Celsius of global warming from occurring. That's still possible. And that should still also give us hope as we mitigate and adapt to climate change over the next several years. And with that, I hand back to Abubakar, and I hope there's a bit of time for discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this good presentation, technical presentation on the climate change and the different scenario of temperature increase and its devastating impact for the African continent. Thank you for this information and mainly the recommendation from COP26 and excellent work, good job you done. Your presentation makes the transition to the second session on climate change. We don't have a possibility to ask some questions, and I think your presentation will be available for the participant on the website. And again,
Indeed,
thank you,
indeed.
Francois. Thank you. It's very, very instructive. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, everybody.
This is the end of this opening session, and we have less more than
Hello. Hello.
Hello, Phoebe.
There you go. We lost you for a minute. I think you can proceed.
Okay.
Hello, Abubakar, can you hear me? Hello? Okay, seems like we're having challenges with Abubakar. If we can just take one question critically, then I think we will allow for that. So I would request that you pose your question on chat, on the QA, then we'll be able to address it from there. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Okay, we don't seem to have any questions right now. So there is a question addressed to Yana. We still have Yana. So the question is, can you offer us thoughts on the significant Earth observation development which are relevant to AfriGEO? Yana, can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Robinson, are you able to address the question that Emil is asking, if you can be able to highlight any significant Earth observation development which are relevant to AfriGEO?
Hi, Emil. Thank you. Hope you can hear me. I think there are a number of initiatives on the continent now that are mainly trying to address the development challenges and also looking at the societal benefit side of things that GEO is quite keen on. Issues to do with weather and climate. We're currently facing a drought situation in Eastern Africa, which are a number of partners, Severe and others, have been able to look into and provide forecasts with Met agencies that speak into what you expect in a drought scenario and how far into the months that the drought is likely to stretch. So looking at the different products that you can use from a Earth observation perspective, both blended products and rainfall products, temperature products, there are a lot of value that the Earth observation and in this connection to geo would bring to societal benefit, that governments have been able to at least know or anticipate that there is going to be a drought or a flood and plan in advance. We can go on and on into issues of land use, land cover change. I think Africa is seeing unprecedented urbanization, both in large cities and in smaller cities. And you continue to get demand for resources for the African cities to urbanize. The other factor, of course, is population, all of which have a dimension to Earth observation. So I think there are different initiatives, like I said, on the continent. GMES is trying to address a number of these challenges on land degradation and wetlands. DEA is looking into the same space. Severe has a couple of services addressing planning and policy dimensions. So there are different ways we can look at it, but thank you for the question.
Thank you, Robinson. I'm not sure if Abubakar is back. In case he is not, I would want to bring to light a statement made by UMETCAST, talking about, it's very clear, I think this is in relation to Francois's presentation, it's very clear and straightforward. And looking at this from an EO point of view, there are certain areas that EO can be able to contribute in relation to IPCC efforts, climate resilience, as well as adaptation, part of which include monitoring of carbon dioxide emissions and other GHG gases, monitoring of essential variables such as rainfall, sea surface temperatures, etc., as well as support for disaster monitoring and early warning. So the EO contribution here is undoubted, and I think we just need to dive in a little more to make sure that we're being proactive. So in terms of the question that he has is whether AfriGEO is going to be including this in its implementation plan, and the answer to that is yes. We are in the next few months getting into the new phase of developing a new implementation plan, and these are some of the considerations that we want to take forward. I think I want to end it at that. I want to thank all the guest speakers, Yana, Hubulani, Robinson on behalf of the RCMRD DG, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Francois for the wonderful presentation. I want us to take like a 10 minutes break, and please be sure to log into the next session. There was an email sent out to all the registered participants that has links to session 1 and session 2. So we're just concluding session 1 of the day. Session 2 will be on climate change. So please log in 10 minutes so that we can start that session. Thank you very much.